It's August 2025. Glad so many of you could be here for our College Autism Network Virtual Association of Scholars, or Canvas, presentation. I'm Brett Nachman with the College Autism Network. It is a pleasure to have you here. We know that many of you have attended our presentations slash meetings in the past. For a few of you, this might be new. This is a great space on a monthly basis where we gather together scholars and practitioners and self-advocates and so many more folks who have connections to autism and higher education, and engage in good conversation about recent and emergent research on this front or on these fronts. And really glad today to have Doctors Christine Moeller and Hala Annabi from the University of Washington join us to talk about their work on uncovering the subtle differences and commonalities in the workplace experiences of autistic and ADHD librarians. Um, I understand that they've shared this work in some other spaces, including um, here in Pittsburgh back in May, if I'm not mistaken, uh, for for some neurodiversity programming. And I know this is of great interest to them, and it's of great interest to us as well. So we're looking forward to diving more deeply into that. As a reminder to folks, we would love for you to record your names and information in the meeting agenda, so that way we know who is here. I'm putting that in the chat once again in case you need that. We're going to begin with a few updates on the College Autism Network front and turn it over to you all. But before we even get to all of that, we know it is the end of the summer. For some of us, that's joyous. Others, maybe not. But I'm going to drop in a little prompt in the chat if you feel inclined to participate in it, a little icebreaker. What was the highlight of your summer? So you're also welcome to share verbally if you'd like to communicate that way, but let's kind of hear what people have been up to. We haven't had a Canvas meeting since May. We've had some other programming through CAN in the past few months, but haven't gathered people together in this space. What was the highlight of your summer? Hopefully a positive one. So we have Holland mentioning enjoying lots of nature walks and runs along the river. Absolutely, being outside. That's a common theme also for Kathy, who said being able to swim in the lake. Um, Joelda traveled abroad. Very cool. TC also spent some time out on the water. 1 week on an old boat with the whales coming within 20 feet of us. That's very, very neat. Audrey went to Ireland. Very nice. Jody's at the beach. Camille went to the zoo and got to have some cool animal interactions, lake time for Colleen as well. Um, Very nice. It's such a variety, but a lot tethered to just enjoying the outdoors. I'm particularly jealous of seeing whales that close. I went on my very first whale watching cruise this summer, but they weren't quite that close. Very nice. Well, now I think people are inspired to come up with some ideas for how they might spend next summer if they didn't engage in some of these activities. Some updates for here at College Autism Network. We know that many of you are subscribe to our Canvas listserv. Again, that's going to be your mechanism for learning about our forthcoming Canvas presentations, getting the video recordings, but also learning about new research studies, articles, and other resources that folks in our community share. We have well over 850 people on our listserv. That's quite large in scope. So you're also reaching a wide audience there too. So if you're not already subscribed to that, please be sure to explore that. Many of you also know that our College Autism Summit, this is our ninth annual event. This year it is in Pittsburgh. It's just around the corner. We're just under 3 months away from this signature event here at the College Autism Network. So we invite you to join us in Pittsburgh, November 2nd through 5th. We've been really delighted to see so many great content so much great content that's going to be on our docket. We have, I think, about 50 presentations, a poster fair, networking opportunities, keynote, so much more. So we invite you to register. You're going to want to get that early bird registration if possible. That's the end of the first week of September is when early bird registration closes, so a bit of an incentive for a discounted rate for that. And now I turn it over to all of you for a few minutes. Might you have any research studies or resources or celebrations or other items that you'd like to share with the CAN community? Feel free to drop in the chat, or if anybody wants to share anything verbally, this is a great time to do so. It's also very possible that some of you might be reflecting on the summer activities that other people were noting. Much more interesting than the research at times, right? No. Kimberly Douglas mentions a resource related to public libraries and ADHD resources. So it looks like there's a hyperlink there to an article that Kimberly and a colleague published. Um, so kind of a nice tie-in for our conversation today on libraries. So looks like you might want to check that out during or following today's presentation. And Kimberly, I can also put that in our meeting notes so that way some additional folks can access that up as well. So yeah, thank you for sharing that piece of yours. Any other items that people want to pass along? No worries, Kimberly. You say it's a bit dated, but still relevant. Well, we always have something to learn from pieces, whether they're newer um, or have been around a bit longer. Thanks for sharing. Alrighty, well, feel free to drop in the chat if there's anything else you'd like to share with everybody. But at this point, we're going to turn it over to our guest presenters, who I'm going to pin here in the chat so you see their faces. And then we'll take mine off the screen in just a few moments. But really glad to have a pair of presenters for today. It's always great when we have a good group of people. We have Doctors Christine Moeller and Dr. Hala Annabi from the University of Washington Information School. And as mentioned at the top of today's presentation, their title of their work is Uncovering the Subtle Differences and Commonalities in the Workplace Experiences of Autistic and ADHD Librarians. Often in our work with CAMP, we focus on the intersections of different industries, including education and employment, and the kind of those intersections as well. And I imagine that we're going to learn a lot from them. We'll turn it over to them for the next half hour, and we invite you to input any questions, comments, reflections you may have in the chat, and we'll make sure that these two get those addressed at the conclusion of their presentation. So I'll turn it over to you both at this juncture. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent. I just want to make sure that our slides are showing. Perfect. Excellent. Thank you, Brett. And good morning, everyone. My name is Hala Annabi. I use she, her pronouns. For a visual description, I'm a Middle Eastern woman with long brown hair, brown eyes, and I'm wearing a black top. I'm excited to talk to you about a project that we have been working on here at the University of Washington under the leadership of Christine Moeller, that it was funded by the IMLS for the last 3 years. And this particular presentation is one of many components of this larger scale project that help us understand the experiences of neurodivergent librarians in the context of their work. And this presentation reports on some of the differences, the subtle differences, and also the very strong commonalities that we are seeing across these various neurotypes. So We will try to get into that and hopefully not go over time. Um, in a minute, I will give it to Christine to introduce themselves as well. But I want to talk a little bit about this particular initiative. This study is part of many or several studies and an initiative at the University of Washington that tries to address various aspects of employment of neurodivergent people in the workplace. And we are about to launch an institute at the university that takes this work across multiple sectors of the industry. And as I mentioned earlier, this particular study was funded by the Institute of Museums and Library Services, one of our federal grants. And I'm going to give it to Christine to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christine Moeller. I am guest faculty at University of Washington. And in the first 2 years of this project, I was the PhD project lead while I was working on completing my PhD program and dissertation. Let's see, I wanted to say that my pronouns are they or she, and for a visual description of me, I am a middle-aged white woman with short, curly, sort of honey blonde hair, and I'm wearing a black top with a floral print on it. Before coming to this work, I worked in libraries. I was an academic librarian and an instructional designer. And so that was part of my interest in doing this work. But before we dig into more details about our work, I wanted to remind you that even in this virtual space, we all have different needs. Captioning is available if you need or want to turn that on. I will also remind you that we as presenters have needs too, so we may need to ask for questions to be repeated or take some time to process questions before answering. You will see me fidget or stim today, so just expect that. And we invite you to think about how to care for your needs in this virtual space today as well. And it's being recorded, so if you need to step away at any point, please feel free to do so. We get it.
So to start our conversation today, we wanted to talk just briefly about why we chose to focus on libraries. Many of the studies around employment have focused on either, especially recent studies of employment of neurodivergent folks, have focused on a few industries, and far few studies have focused on neurodivergent people in the context of libraries. And we felt libraries are very important because they provide essential spaces and services for various communities, but particularly in our study, we focused on public libraries and academic libraries because we see that academic libraries have a significant place to serve our neurodivergent students, faculty, and staff. Librarianship is a field that appears to be appealing to neurodivergent people from various studies, from representation that we have seen when we sent out calls for participation. Library literature unfortunately overlooks the neurodivergent library workers. There has been increasingly more attention on studies related to serving neurodivergent patrons, but there's very little that focuses on understanding the experiences of librarians and library workers broadly. The core values of librarianship, of inclusion, support, and advocacy are not consistently what we've seen in the literature and what we know from practice have not been consistently applied to the library workplaces. So we set on a journey that Christine has urged us to set on, and many of our earlier studies around providing services for patrons in our libraries, our neurodivergent librarians that we talked to that were providing those services really urged us to look at this space from an employment perspective. So this is why we center on libraries as critical symbols and spaces for the community for inclusion from an employment perspective. And I'll hand it over, or actually I'll do the intro real quick. So the focus of this study, and this is actually the third of a series of studies that we focused on in terms of neuro-inclusion in libraries, have focused on helping us build the capacity of libraries to be inclusive workspaces. to better recruit, onboard, and retain, and maybe even most importantly, advance and support neurodivergent librarians to productive and healthy careers within the librarianship profession. We focused on a few key questions. What are the barriers that librarians experience, and what are some of the best practices, or what we refer to as success enablers, that empower librarians to have good experiences in libraries? We investigated what methods and practices supervisors and employees can use to increase the library's capacity for inclusion of neurodivergent librarians. And we wanted to ask and investigate what are the appropriate educational and resources that can help supervisors and employees implement inclusive practices. So those were our key study areas or focus areas for this work. And we focused on a theoretical lens that my colleague and I, Jill Locke, developed a few years ago in the context of education, in the context of technology, to understand organizational factors that mitigate barriers, considering individual differences across neurodivergent employees. And over the last couple of years, Christine and I adapted this work or this framework to account for the library context. This work focuses on a critical lens, or leverages a critical lens. It's an interpretive study that centers the voices of neurodivergent people in relation to their experience, rather than what we see in many studies, really leveraging neurotypical priorities and questions and voices. So this is a critical framing and centering of neurodivergent voices. And the study actually took us 3 years because we had so many respondents. We were surprised at how many respondents we had. So we actually extended the project to 3 years and across 4 phases. I'm going to hand it over to Christine to talk a little bit more about the theoretical framework.
Yeah, so as Hala mentioned, we had to make a few modifications to this framework for it to suit the library context. And one of the things that we wanted to do in this library context, where there is such a influence of the professional culture of what it means to be a librarian and how that is communicated to all of us who work in this field. And so we wanted to conduct that institutional level examination of the influence of those kinds of expectations and that the impact of that culture on the attitudes and expectations and the barriers that neurodivergent library workers encountered in their workplaces. Through that critical lens, we also wanted to build on the construct of coping strategies and really specifically name the embodied knowledge that neurodivergent library workers bring to their workplace and the things that they deploy from their lived experience of living in a world that continually excludes them. So you see those modifications here shown in blue. And those are how we adapted this for the library context. As Hala mentioned, next slide, we conducted our phase over now 3 years, and it was in 4 phases. And so in the first phase, we did interviews to identify the barriers, enablers, and best practices, right, to better understand what was happening in libraries. And we used those interviews and that data then to build a nationwide survey where we sought to verify and learn more about the barriers, enablers, and best practices in libraries. And then in our third phase, we conducted participatory design sessions to help us develop a toolkit, training, and resources that libraries could use to train their managers and their employees. And so now we are in the 4th phase where we are building that toolkit and we'll share more about that later, but that will be coming soon. And so today, as Hala mentioned earlier, If we can go back to that one. Yeah, we're going to be reporting on some of our findings from our big nationwide survey. Next slide, Hala. And so with that survey, we actually did two. Today we're talking about the responses from our survey of neurodivergent library workers and supervisors. And to that survey, we had 286 responses after cleaning the data. And we used both descriptive and statistical analysis of the data to both understand who our participants were, to understand the barriers that they were encountering, and some of the strategies that they were enacting in their workplaces. But then also to understand some of the differences and to identify some of the patterns within that data. And then because we also had open-ended responses, we used qualitative content analysis and a coding scheme that had been developed from that conceptual framework that you just saw. All right, next slide. And I'm going to give it back to Hala.
So we have short time together, so we wanted to pick some of the most prevalent themes that we saw in our survey of neurodivergent librarians. And the first thing we saw that there were some significant differences, statistically significant differences around the barriers that autistic and ADHD librarians experience versus ADHD librarians experienced. And those differences we characterize them as falling into these 5 buckets. Differences related to the physical and sensory environment, the impact of neurotypical expectations on the well-being and the persistence of neurodivergent librarians, fear of discrimination, differences in identity disclosure, and masking and its implications. And we're going to go through each one, and again, somewhat briefly. And again, I want to emphasize that these are the spaces where there was statistical significance that we saw in the analysis of the data. So as you can see from the slide, there are 2 bar charts that help us understand the experiences related to physical space and the experiences related to sensory space. And what we saw, while all the neurodivergent librarians might have expressed some barriers that they experienced in relation to how the library physical spaces impact their work and their well-being, and how the sensory spaces impact their work and their well-being. What we noticed is more autistic and ADHD librarians identified that physical spaces and sensory spaces pose significant or moderate or major barrier for their work. We saw that ADHDers, while some experience it, there were fewer of them that experience these barriers as major. There were more of them that would say it's not a barrier or it's a minor barrier. So again, the key thing is aspects of the physical environment. You can think of it in terms of temperature, you can think of it in terms of the layout, you can think of it in terms of the open workspaces, or the sensory environment in terms of light, cold, noise, and activity, as presenting barriers. But those barriers were more significant for autistic participants, so autistics or ADHD, than they were for ADHDers. So that was the first major difference that we saw in the experiences. And again, why we ask these questions and do these analysis is because we wanted to identify what are the unique needs across neurotypes so that we can design workspaces that are appropriate, that do not create monolithic designs and expectations and practices necessarily. The second barrier that our neurodivergent librarians expressed in the survey related to the impact of neurotypical expectations. When we think of neurotypical expectations, it's around communication conduct, professional conduct, coordination, how they interact across neurotypes. And we saw that more autistic and ADHD participants ranked neurotypical expectations as having a barrier, being a barrier, or having a negative impact as a major barrier compared to ADHDers who rank this as minor barrier or no barrier. Again, this is in terms of the rates at which each of these neurotypes might report them as a barrier and the significance of that barrier. So while some ADHDers did report as a major or moderate barrier, more of them reported these barriers as less of a barrier compared to autistic librarians. Christine.
So another area of statistically significant difference was the fear of discrimination or of negative behavior toward the employee in some way. And in this area, we observed that more autistic and ADHD participants had ranked this as a major barrier, while ADHDers, more of them, ranked this as not a barrier. So this posed a more significant barrier to our autistic and ADHD librarians. And next slide. Another area of significant difference was around identity disclosure. And so we asked questions about under what circumstances people would disclose their neurodivergent identity and to whom. And what we noticed here is that the autistic and ADHD participants were much less likely to report that they had disclosed their neurodivergence to both their peers, their coworkers, and their supervisors than the ADHD participants who reported that they were openly disclosing at much higher rates. And so openly means, to coworkers, to supervisors, even sometimes to library patrons, right? And so what we were seeing then was that a much a lower likelihood of autistic and ADHD participants being able to be open about their neurodivergent identity in their workplace, which leads us into our next slide, which is about masking, right? If you can't reveal your identity in the workplace, then you may be masking in the workplace. And what we saw here when we looked into that very issue was that a higher rate of autistic and ADHD participants were ranking this as a major barrier in their library workplace. And the ADHD participants more of them were ranking this as not a barrier or a minor barrier. And so while we did see in all of these areas, right, that there was some variation, it wasn't necessarily that this wasn't a barrier in any way. What we see across all of these is a matter of, right, as we said in our title, it's about subtle differences. It's a matter of degree. And so the autistic and ADHD participants are experiencing this barrier to a higher degree in more of a way than the ADHD participants. And next slide. So after we saw some of these significant differences in terms of the barriers, we also wanted to look at the success enablers, right? What had our participants emphasized enabled their success in the library workplace? And so we asked them, to what degree have these things supported your success in libraries? And we noticed that everyone there were high rates of not a support for multiple enablers. And yet, when we looked at many of these enablers, things like flexible schedule, having a supportive team, clear and transparent communication, we also noticed that everyone, ADHD, autistic, ADHD participants, were all identifying these as major supports in their ideal workplace. And yet to this particular question, we saw these high rates of identifying this as not a support. And so what this suggests to us then is that they were answering this question in terms of what currently exists in their workplace. And so this lack of significant difference in the responses to this question actually demonstrates that our participants were encountering a general lack of these enablers in their library workplaces. Next slide. And this actually aligns with what they were also reporting to some of our open-ended questions. One of our participants observed that everyone is so pressed for time, funding, and general resources that there's little time for anyone to address the issues that were covered in this survey. Right? It is a reason, it's not an excuse, but it does sort of explain what we were seeing in the survey responses. Next quote. Another participant observed that I expect that libraries have a greater than average percentage of employees who are neurodivergent, but it would really help if library leaders educated themselves on neurodiversity. Neurodivergent people are very good at many types of library work, and if you foster their success rather than expecting them to behave in neurotypical ways, you can accomplish great things. That's what we hope we can help make possible.
Yes. And one of the things we didn't get into, and I wanted to highlight about this quote in particular, one of the important dimensions of how we study this work to identify individual differences in the context of a work setting, one of the unique contributions of Christine's background in librarianship was to introduce the cultural or professional lens as a new construct. And in our paper, you'll see some real interaction analysis around the library profession as a construct and the things that are so embedded around professionalism, how you show up to work, what you do, how you interact, the above and beyond service that you are expected to provide at your own cost, that is grounded and really embedded and captured in this higher professionalism construct, is really important, especially if I draw on my work in the tech industry. When I studied women in technology, some of the professional constructs around the technology, particularly around the different behaviors around professionalism, dress, interaction, were actually places that drew some of the women autistic technology workers to that profession, because they didn't have to mask in certain ways and in certain communication styles. And so when we look across different professions, especially related to this assimilation and masking, we can start seeing differences. So this is a really unique, in my mind, contribution of this work and this theoretical lens that Christine introduced in their work, in particular in this study, that I wanted to highlight. This is we see it across multiple professions, neurotypical expectations, but it gets more complex and amplified when certain professions like librarianship have very rigid, neurotypically oriented expectations. So I just want to triple emphasize what this quote tells us and what some of the other data. So let's get to some of the general takeaways, kind of to summarize the flyby that we did with some of the quantitative data. So autistic, ADHD, and ADHD librarians all experience similar work barriers, but to different degrees. While they all will refer to certain environmental barriers, for example, or neurotypical expectations, the degrees to which they report them and the impact, and I know there's a question in the chat about the impact of that work and what it means for these neurotypes, is more nuanced. And in our further analysis, when we start looking at age and gender and race, we actually see some of those nuances even being more complex. Because again, that intersectionality comes into play that we didn't have time to present on today. The other really interesting fact that some of us might have anticipated, some might not, the survey responses revealed no significant difference in success enablers reported, in both the fact that they didn't have them in their current work environments and how they are really important for the ideal work environment. Now, if you bring my organizational perspective on this, when we look at what are best practices managerially, much of the success enablers that folks are asking for are generally considered management principles that are often ignored. So again, many of the success enablers, not all, but many of the success enablers are increasingly critical success enablers for all employees. But unfortunately, our work environments critical managerial experiences and practices that are important for all employees, much or physical environments that are conducive to one's well-being and are adaptive. So the analysis, I'll just give you a quick peek preview with our neurotypical librarians and neurotypical there's actually very our next presentation, hopefully, we will show you the differences between neurotypical and neurodivergent librarians and their experiences. Such cool work. We got more data than we had anticipated, and I think it's going to take us a couple of years to unpack all of it. So again, I want to highlight that the key takeaway the study highlights is how important it is to address workplace barriers according to individual differences, really thinking about the nuances across neurotypes, but also neurotypes and across other identity dimensions of identity that we didn't have a chance to really get into. All of the things that we have learned, and we have a lot of rich qualitative data as well as quantitative data that giving us some important suggestions for practical takeaways. So we're translating all of our findings through the participatory design sessions, through all of this rich data that we got into a toolkit. This will be our third toolkit that we're producing for neurodiversity, whether it's in the Autism Ready Library Toolkit, all of the neurodiversity at work playbooks. This one is specific neurodiversity employment in libraries toolkit. We anticipate a launch date in October. We will send it to Can so that you can have it. And it's going to include 4 distinct components: training for libraries and MLIS programs around neurodiversity and neuroinclusion, resources specific to supervisors, what we learned from both supervisors and neurodivergent and neurotypical librarians about what supervisors can do. One thing we didn't say, and I have to say it, this study is one of the first also that studied neurodivergent supervisors in the context of one profession. And we've reported on that in a different paper that we can share with you all. And then we also, one of the urgings of neurodivergent librarians was a toolkit to help them with their advocacy. So we have a success kit for neurodivergent librarians, and there could be a few other things we are actually focusing on. Psychological safety in the context of libraries, knowing your rights, and communication and collaboration tools that will be there. So stay tuned for October. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Christine to guide us through some Q&A and some discussions.
Yeah, so we have some guidelines. We always use this in our presentations, and really, this is just a reminder to make sure that you are asking questions that are suitable to everyone in the room or in this virtual space. And if they aren't, you can always follow up with us. You can contact us via email. But we tend to like to encourage people to ask questions that will help everyone in this space during this time. And with that, then I think Brett was going to be watching the questions for us. So I will hand it back to Brett to guide us through our Q&A.
Thank you, excuse me. Thank you both. This was excellent, totally riveting. I'm really intrigued. And I know I have a bunch of questions, but more importantly, our fellow attendees and folks here have questions. So let's turn it over to them. Um, and we have a few in the chat, but I encourage folks to input them in the chat or share them verbally as they'd like over the next 15 minutes. We'll start off with TCs. Of those who experienced major barriers, did they identify how these barriers affected them in significant ways? Perhaps either or both of you can disentangle that.
Christine, I'll let you take this one, especially from all the qualitative analysis you did.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we really noticed across all of our participants was that not only did these barriers lead to them feeling excluded and isolated within their workplace, but it also took a a personal toll on them as well. So they reported just about how exhausted they were when they came home from work, for example, because they were dealing with all of these barriers throughout their workday. They talked about, they shared stories with us about how they, they could barely think about like meal planning and, muster the energy to do their laundry. And so these barriers were really having a deep impact on the participants. And as well as so many of them shared that they were experiencing burnout, and a number of our participants also, reported that they weren't sure they wanted to stay in the profession because they were experiencing so much burnout, but then they also weren't sure what else they would do. And so that I would say that these barriers had a really deep impact both on their professional experience, but also their personal lives as well.
Great. I think you covered a lot of different facets there, Christine. It looks like we have a question from Kimberly wants to share their question verbally, and then we'll turn it over to Jody's question in the chat. Go ahead, Kimberly.
Kimberly, we can't hear you.
And no luck so far. Kimberly, if you might want to enter your question in the chat, and we can see if the audio works momentarily.
Okay.
Oh, I think
Can you hear me?
yes, I think
Okay.
so.
There's something weird, like I closed my laptop and opened it back up and it works. Okay. So first of all, let me just say I really appreciate this work. I'm very excited about it because it brings together two worlds that are very important to me. Before I ask my question, I want to clarify something. This did include academic librarians, right? Okay, so this relates to something that I co-authored like back in 2014, and I'll put that in the chat as well. Where my a co-author and we were looking at the tensions that come with that academic librarians experience with faculty status and gaining faculty status. And so there was something that you said in your talk where you talked about um, the professional lens as a social construct. And if you want to talk about a professional lens, tenure and promotion is absolutely one of those professional lenses that is a very rigid kind of social construct, but also fuzzy social construct. So I'm just wondering if you're going to be looking at anything around this, but it also inspired, I also want to let you know that it inspired me to pick our study back up and look and I see like ways that these things connect. But I'm just interested if you had any discussions about tenure and faculty, tenure promotion status in the library.
So I'll take this one. I would say we did not in the survey. That was difficult to address in a nationwide survey because we were looking at both public libraries where, that doesn't exist. In fact, it's very hard to advance in public libraries without moving to a different role. And in academic, that's why I was an academic librarian. And in academic librarians, there has become such a wide variety of statuses afforded to academic librarians, that even if we had solely looked at academic libraries, there's been a real move away from affording academic librarians tenure, that kind of faculty status. And so, it's even less than half the profession now, that is able to pursue tenure in that way. However, it did absolutely come up in the first phase of our study when I was interviewing librarians. And as you were speaking, I remembered how one of my participants had talked about um, how difficult the tenure process was for them, how they had been given advice by their supervisor not to talk about the role of their neurodivergence in their work. Another person felt that they had been denied tenure because of their neurodivergent ways of being, right? So we definitely saw this come up in our academic interviews, and it particularly aligned, I would say, with what we were saying earlier around neurotypical expectations in library and the way that the professional culture um, reifies these neurotypical practices, and incorporates them into what it means to be a librarian, right? To be a librarian means that you make eye contact and you smile with the people who come into your library. And so, that again, that has a profound impact on people whose ways of being don't align with those kinds of expectations. So hopefully that answers your
It
question there.
does. And thank you. It definitely
Yeah.
does. Thank you.
Wonderful. We have a question from Jody who asks, can you share any specifics about what physical and sensory elements were most challenging for the participants? Jody says that we are finding similar experiences for autistic educators with specific challenges around lighting and sound.
Yeah. So maybe we'll highlight three explicit ones. Light, especially in libraries, very, very large fluorescent lighting, was sometimes flickering and not maintained well as well. So 2 layers of lighting. Sometimes many of library spaces, because they're big, have no natural light. And they have these fluorescent lights. But most importantly, no way to adjust lighting based on what you need to do and your state and your well-being. Same thing with noise. Not having private spaces to do some deeper work or to also not be overwhelmed by what's happening around you. So librarians are expected to work in open spaces. Many of them are expected to also be at the front desk in rotational ways, regardless of what their cognitive load looks like that day, or their also one of the things to understand is what we looked at are also other dimensions of or other disabilities that also affect and interact with neurodivergence that relate to the physical space. So not having spaces that you can control and adapt based on what you're experiencing, not only based on your neurodivergence, but co-occurring conditions that you have, which are very high also, that we noticed. Librarians did not feel any ability to control or retreat to spaces. But we heard that, we find our little corners, we go together. The embodied knowledge that they brought to the workplace was really important, but also seeing the dimension where when one librarian will learn how to do that, they will help others. Other neurodivergent librarians also adapt some of these embodied knowledge as well. So Jody, I hope that answers your question.
These are really good questions. We do have time for at least another question as we perhaps wait for another from the group today. I'll throw out one to both of you. I'm curious, and I'm sure you clearly didn't have enough time to go into all the fun data points, and some of the demographic information. I'm curious about the role of geography and where, if you're noticing any trends in terms of the sizes of the libraries or cities for which people are associated with, and if there are any connections in terms of the types of support that they get or not. I recognize that's perhaps painting with broad strokes, but I'm curious about any distinctions you may have noticed there.
I think I'll defer to Christine, but if I remember, we did ask geographies, but I don't think we had enough to show significant statistical significant differences, right? But in our qualitative work, one of the things we noticed in smaller, less resourced libraries is librarians are expected to do everything, regardless of their role and their specialty. And in undersourced libraries, and you could associate those with also certain geographical areas, Brett, librarians felt completely depleted because there's an orientation around self-sacrifice for service. So that I think is one that I remember from focus groups that I was participating in was re-emphasized very heavily. There are not many of us. We're losing funding. This was even before the switches. Like for example, in Washington State libraries recently lost a lot of funding in our region. But even before that, we've seen this consistent theme around we're so low resourced and we're expected to do everything. And that's creating really high levels of burnout.
Yeah, and the only thing I will add to that is that there was also sort of an intersectional impact of this as well, in terms of regional culture, right? So if you think about certain geographic areas, there were more book bans, for example, libraries being targeted in that way. And so the librarians who had multiple marginalized identities were feeling those impacts in specific ways that, for example, the white women weren't necessarily experiencing or experiencing to the same degree. And so that regional culture sort of played a role there in terms of geography as well, particularly for the people who identified a racialized identity, or identified as some degree of queer, gay. Our trans participants really spoke to what it meant for them to be in that area at this time, and the impact that that had on them as well. So that's another way that I see the geography playing a role in some of these experiences.
Britt, I want to take one question I noticed in the chat from Dr. T.C. Wiseman. I hope I pronounced it correctly, related to suggestions that we may have for supervisors who are not neurodivergent, knowledgeable, or affirming. So we have many, and those come from experienced supervisors, neurodivergent librarians, and maybe I'll highlight a few of them. One is self-awareness about knowledge and intentionality around educating oneself about neurodiversity is where you start with that self-awareness. There are many practices that we hear around explicit directions and communication, but I want to summarize it because we don't have that much time with, and this is a practice that is critical related to neuro inclusion, creating alignments and clear expectations within a team and across a supervisor-supervisee relationship by being intentional about asking expectations. What are the best ways to communicate? What are the best ways to collaborate? Help me understand expectations about autonomy versus detailed direction around work. Creating workspaces that are adaptable, not judging and forcing assimilation, but understanding different ways of being and communicating about it directly in affirming ways. We have a whole bunch that we can go into, but at the heart of it is understanding that different individuals have different needs at different times of the day or the year or what's happening outside of their world, and creating these check-in alignments regularly to see and calibrate the work and the expectations. I call it kind of like the meta umbrella of practices that create inclusion. But asking questions to understand without judgment around what is the best way for me to support you, and then being explicit about the expectations and having a negotiation, whether those expectations are reasonable or not, is a very quick summary that I would provide. And I want to give Christina a chance to see if they have a high level summary that they would like to add.
Oh, I think that's pretty good, Hala. The only thing I was going to add, I was about to type it in the chat, but just I was going to say that, as a neurodivergent employee, librarian myself, who had supervisors who didn't come from that perspective, one of the things that I did was, this is, going to speak to some of the advocacy part that we're working on for our toolkit, but, I found sneaky ways, right, to raise these issues across the whole team. So for example, when we were talking about revamping our instruction program, I brought up accessibility and neurodiversity. And so it was my way to sort of help educate the staff. And yes, that meant sort of taking on extra work myself, but it also meant that like I didn't necessarily have to expose myself or my identity in ways that I wasn't comfortable with in the workplace. And so I think for all of us neurodivergent employees who are in that situation, we kind of have to make a choice for ourselves about what feels comfortable and where we feel like we can push those boundaries. And whether that's with your supervisor or taking a sneaky stealth method like I did, right? It's finding a way that works for you, in a way that doesn't sort of contribute to additional barriers for you in your workplace.
So much great stuff. And thank you also for Hala for addressing TC's additional question there. I think I may have overlooked that. Lots of really good content. Thank you both, Doctors Moeller and Nobby. This was so fascinating. I think we're all excited to see the toolkit when that debuts, and certainly share that out with the CAN community so that further folks can engage with it. I'll remind folks that our next Canvas presentation is set for Thursday, September 18th. My colleagues Katie Tobin McDermott and Carly Ball Isaacson. These two are my direct colleagues for whom we're working on a nationwide study of autistic college student success. We have a paper on friendship experiences among autistic college students, and you're going to learn from Katie and Carly about all the really fun and interesting stuff we unpacked there. So we'll look forward to seeing many of you then. In the meantime, stay attuned to what's happening on our Canvas listserv. And thank you all for coming today. Have a good rest of your Tuesday.